I was in mid-sentence with Dr. Stroman when your call beeped in. I glanced at the time and said, "It's my dad. I gotta go." She said, "Oh, it is Wednesday. Tell Willie I said hi." And then she hung up. As quickly as I said, "Hey, Dad," I had forgotten about that mid-sentence interruption. I had forgotten what it was that I needed to tell her. You see, Dr. Stroman knew what anyone who really knows me knew. It was Wednesday night. It was 10 p.m. It was time to talk to my dad. Some time ago, a friend asked, how did our weekly conversations begin? What was it that made us press pause on everything else in the world and for a few minutes, sometimes a few hours, create a safe space that was only shared between us? What was it that made us be intentional about our communication? I told her I couldn't remember what that initial conversation was, but I do know that I had recently moved to DC and we had been playing a lot of phone tag. And you said we need to pick a day and a time and talk every week. We went through our schedules and landed on Wednesday nights at 10. Your Bible study ended at 9:30. My classes ended at 9:45. But when it began, neither of us knew that for the next decade, we would talk every Wednesday night at 10. From my long, lanky frame to the way my upper body outpaces my lower body when I walk, I am my father's child. The similarity between our idiosyncrasies, our habits, our behaviors, are what makes our relationship authentically our own. Now, in addition to these characteristics, I also inherited my father's strong will. Now, I wasn't a disrespectful child, but I did know how to challenge authority. If the answer was no, it was no, but I made him work for that no. One day, in the midst of being frustrated by one of my inquisitions, my dad looks at my mom and says, "Where does this girl get this from?" She looks up from whatever she was working on and says, "You," and quietly returns to her task. When I was 25, I quit my stable job, moved out of the apartment I shared with my best friend, and accepted a position that allowed me to teach English as a second language in Mexico. Now, to most folks, this seemed like an interesting opportunity, but my daddy could not wrap his mind around the idea of his baby girl trotting around in some unfamiliar territory. But when I moved to Mexico, my dad, who only used computers for data entry and other work-related tasks, asked my mom to set him up one of those emails so he could keep in touch with me. My host family didn't have the internet, but there was a cyber cafe close by, so 4, 5, sometimes 6 days a week, I would hand over my pesos, log into my email, and wait for the glorious phrase, "You've got mail." Those emails, coupled with expensive international phone calls, are what helped us maintain our relationship when face-to-face communication wasn't an option. Interpersonal relationships have always mattered a great deal to me, and I value the influence that they have on my ability to shift and grow. So a few years later, when I arrived at Howard University, I built upon that same foundation. In true Kesha form, I quickly established meaningful and lasting long-term interpersonal relationships, but that didn't replace my need to remain connected to my daddy. And while our relationship as an adult child and parent is less prescriptive than it was during my upbringing, it is still a guiding force in my life. We talked for quite a while tonight, longer than we have in a long time. I filled you in on the final plans for the wedding. I reminded you that we were having dinner with my future in-laws the day after you and Mommy arrived in Florida. We would stay in Orlando, but rent an extra car, drive over so everyone could connect. You said, "That's fine, we'll be there." And then you asked me how I was doing. The stress of wedding planning was taxing, but I respond, "I'm maintaining. It's coming together." And then you asked me something that had been looming over us. We had just kept talking around life that night. We just kept beating around the bush. We talked about the weather. We talked about what we saw on television, what a student said in class. And then you addressed what had been looming over us for months. I guess we'll have to decide if I keep calling you on Wednesdays. I sort of laughed and said, "Of course you will." You said, "Yeah, but you'll be a married woman soon. I have to respect that. You'll be someone's wife." I shift the conversation to something insignificant, but I understood the deeper connotative meanings of your words. I understood that somehow we had purchased the ideology that marriage suggested adult. And so it didn't matter that I had lived in another country, that I owned a home, or that I was a college professor. In my heart and in your heart, until I said I do, I was still Daddy's little girl. After I got married, the conversations between my father and I, they still continued. Like everyone else, my husband quickly grew to understand how important these conversations were to me. Over the years, our conversation topics shifted, but my father's role as my cheerleader remained the same. What started out as a way to remain connected when separated by distance and life became a lifeline during some of the most challenging moments of my life. When my husband and I decided to have children, we didn't anticipate the journey that was ahead. We didn't anticipate the miscarriages. We didn't anticipate the mixture of alternative and traditional medicine. We didn't anticipate the stress, the expense, the work. With a miscarriage, it's a loss that most people don't know you're experiencing. It's like you convince yourself that by not talking about it, it hurts less. I got pregnant. It didn't stick. It hurt. I got pregnant again. It didn't stick. Again. It hurt. Again. But it was 10 p.m. and it was time to talk to my daddy. I hadn't told my dad that I was pregnant again. I hadn't told him that I was just getting home from the hospital after another loss. Instead, I forced myself through a somewhat scripted conversation and hoped that he wouldn't notice. But for someone who knows me best, he recognized that something was off, but also understood that as his adult daughter, he had to respect that I needed the space to process. And while in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to tell my dad about the loss, the consistency of our communication and his presence helped me stand while I felt suffocated by grief. I set my alarm to wake up a few minutes before 10. I want to stay awake for your call, but I've just been so exhausted. I drag myself in from work, I throw a pillow on the floor, and I sleep until you call. The phone rings, and I try to make myself sound awake when I say hello. You tell me about your week so far. On Monday, you cut the grass. On Tuesday, you picked up some items from the restaurant. On Wednesday, you led noonday Bible study. You said Mommy had gone back to church to work with her Sunshine Band kids, but you were at home resting in your chair. I tell you I had a couple meetings that day and that Thursday would be a long day. That was my cue to end the call. I haven't told you that I'm pregnant for a third time. I haven't really told anyone just yet. I'm scared that if I say it out loud and I lose my baby again, it'll hurt. Again. Maybe I'll tell you next week. Eventually, I did tell my dad, as that pregnancy and the one that followed resulted in healthy baby boys who are active members of the Sunshine Band and Pop-Pop's after-school program. In the beginning, my conversations with my dad were so easy. Wednesday nights were the perfect way to decompress from the busyness of city life and the rigors of a graduate program. Most days, his call would come in right as I walked in the door. I would plop down on my futon, and the release would begin. We'd talk about everything under the sun and only hang up when we ran out of things to say. It didn't matter who I was with or what I was doing. There were no competing priorities. My dad had my undivided attention. Through our conversations, I learned that the Superman of my childhood was most certainly super, but is in fact a man. I got to know my dad in ways that, as a child, I could not have understood, as he accepted that while I am his youngest child, I'm still a grown woman. My family and I moved back to my hometown, and I see my dad on nearly a daily basis. I suppose this, coupled with an increasingly busy schedule and equally busy boys, have moved us away from my weekly Wednesday nights with Willie. But I must admit, I miss the consistency. I miss the sacredness of that space. And while I most certainly don't want to be dismissive of the needs of the folks who are right in front of me, there are moments when my mind takes me back to where our conversations began. Back to a place where on Wednesday nights at 10, nothing else in the world mattered but me and my dad. Thank you.